I always thought of myself as a loyal wife. My husband, Greg, was a good man, steady, reliable, and kind. We'd been married for 12 years, and while our relationship wasn't as exciting as it had once been, it was solid. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But life has a way of sneaking up on you, of exposing cracks in the things you thought were unbreakable. It all started when I got a part-time job at a local boutique to help with our finances. The store was small but bustling, a place where I could keep busy and interact with people outside the monotony of home. And that's where I met Ryan. Ryan was young, probably 10 years younger than me, and he worked as the store's security guard. He was one of those people who had an effortless charm, the kind that draws you in before you even realize it. He'd always greet me with a grin, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and it wasn't long before our casual conversations turned into something more. It started innocently enough, a joke here, a compliment there. But as the weeks went on, I found myself looking forward to our shifts together. He had a way of making me feel seen in a way Greg hadn't in years. One evening, as we closed the store together, Ryan lingered at the door. "You've got a great laugh, you know that," he said, his voice low. I felt a flush creep up my neck, but I laughed it off, brushing past him with a casual, "Thanks, Ryan. Good night." But as I drove home, his words played over and over in my head, igniting something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't long before our interactions became more than just friendly. We'd find excuses to spend time alone during breaks, our conversations growing deeper and more personal. He told me about his struggles, how he'd married young, how he felt trapped in a relationship that wasn't what he'd hoped for. I shared bits of my own life too, things I hadn't even told Greg, and before I knew it, we'd crossed a line I didn't even see coming. The first time Ryan kissed me, it felt like the world stopped. I knew it was wrong, but in that moment, all I could think about was how alive I felt. For the first time in years, I wasn't just someone's wife or someone's mom, I was me. And I wasn't ready to let that feeling go. We kept things discreet, stealing moments whenever we could. Lunch breaks in his car, lingering glances across the store, text messages late at night when Greg was asleep. It was thrilling and intoxicating, but also terrifying. I knew what I was doing was wrong, that I was risking everything, but I couldn't seem to stop. And Ryan seemed to feel the same way, until one day, everything changed. It was a quiet afternoon at the store, and Ryan seemed distracted. When I pressed him about it, he hesitated before saying, "I think we need to slow this down." My heart sank, but I nodded, trying to play it cool. "Yeah, maybe you're right," I said, even though every fiber of my being wanted to protest. Over the next few weeks, our interactions became more subdued, more distant. I told myself it was for the best, that this was my chance to get my life back on track. But then, one evening, as I was closing the store alone, Ryan showed up unexpectedly. He looked tense, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with something darker. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice strained. "My wife found some of our messages." My heart stopped. "What? How?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "She didn't see everything," he said quickly. "I told her it was just a coworker joking around. But we need to be more careful." From that moment on, the dynamic between us shifted. The thrill was gone, replaced by a sense of dread and paranoia. Every time my phone buzzed, I'd panic, thinking it might be Greg or Ryan's wife. Every time Greg looked at me a little too long, I wondered if he suspected something. The guilt was eating me alive, but I didn't know how to stop. Ryan and I ended things not long after that conversation. It was mutual, neither of us could handle the stress anymore. We agreed to keep our distance, to pretend like nothing had happened. And somehow, we pulled it off. Greg never found out, and as far as I know, Ryan's wife didn't either. But even now, months later, I can't shake the weight of what I did. I've tried to convince myself that it's over, that it doesn't matter anymore, but the truth is, it changed me. And no matter how hard I try, I can't go back to who I was before. Even after Ryan and I ended things, the echoes of our actions lingered in my life like shadows that refused to disappear. I went back to work at the boutique, pretending nothing had happened, carefully avoiding anything that might stir up suspicion. Ryan kept his distance, and though we worked the occasional overlapping shift, we barely exchanged more than polite greetings. It should have been a relief to have the temptation removed, but instead, I felt a strange emptiness. The thrill, the danger, the connection I'd felt with Ryan, it was gone, leaving behind a dull ache I couldn't explain. At home, I threw myself into being the perfect wife and mother. I packed Greg's lunches with handwritten notes tucked inside, planned elaborate outings for the kids, and kept the house spotless. On the surface, everything looked picture perfect, but inside, I felt like I was playing a part in a play I no longer wanted to be in. Greg seemed to notice my newfound enthusiasm, but he didn't question it. "You've been incredible lately," he said one evening, pulling me into a hug. "I don't know what I'd do without you." His words were meant to comfort, but instead, they only deepened the guilt that had taken root in my chest. I tried to channel my unease into therapy, framing my struggles as general dissatisfaction rather than revealing the real reason behind my turmoil. "I just feel disconnected," I told my therapist during one session. "Like I'm going through the motions but not really living." She nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like you're carrying something heavy," she said gently. "Sometimes, letting go starts with acknowledging what you're holding on to." Her words struck a chord, but I wasn't ready to open that door, not to her, and certainly not to myself. Ryan, meanwhile, became an enigma in my mind. Part of me wondered if he felt the same weight of regret I did, if his silence was a reflection of his own guilt. But another part of me resented him for moving on so easily, or at least, that's how it appeared. He'd flash his charming smile to customers, laugh with coworkers, and act as though nothing had ever happened. It made me question everything. Had I meant as much to him as he'd claimed? Or was I just a passing distraction in his messy life? The breaking point came on an otherwise ordinary day at work. Ryan's wife came into the boutique, her presence sending a jolt of panic through me. She was younger than I expected, with a quiet, graceful confidence that made me feel small and insignificant. She didn't look at me twice, just browsed the racks and chatted politely with the cashier. But as she left, she paused to wave at Ryan, who was stationed near the entrance. "See you at home," she said, her tone light and casual. I watched as Ryan waved back, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. The moment passed quickly, but it left me reeling. That evening, as I sat at the dinner table with Greg and the kids, I couldn't shake the image of Ryan and his wife. They were rebuilding their lives, stitching together the pieces of whatever cracks had formed between them. And yet, here I was, stuck in a limbo of my own making. I wanted to believe that keeping the truth from Greg was an act of love, a way to protect him from pain. But deep down, I knew it was just another layer of the lies I'd built around myself. I thought about writing Ryan a letter, something to clear the air and finally close the door on what had happened between us. But every time I tried, the words wouldn't come. What could I possibly say? "I'm sorry" felt hollow, and "I miss you" was a truth I wasn't ready to confront. In the end, I settled for silence, hoping that time would dull the edges of my guilt and longing. As the weeks turned into months, life began to settle into a fragile equilibrium. Greg remained blissfully unaware, his trust in me unwavering. The kids thrived in the stability of our home, their laughter filling the spaces where my regrets tried to take root. I told myself that this was enough, that I didn't need closure or forgiveness to move forward. But there were still nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever truly be free of the choices I'd made. Ryan eventually left the boutique, moving on to another job in a different town. His departure should have been a relief, a chance to finally put the past behind me. But instead, it felt like the end of a chapter one hadn't been ready to close. I thought about him less as time went on, though his memory lingered in unexpected moments, a song on the radio, a customer's smile, the way the light fell through the store's windows in the late afternoon. In the quiet of my mind, I told myself a story, that Ryan and I were just two people searching for something we couldn't find in our own lives, that what happened between us was a mistake born out of loneliness and unmet needs. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew the truth was more complicated. For now, I keep my secrets buried, tucked away in the corners of my mind where Greg will never find them. He deserves better than the truth, better than the broken version of me that stumbled into an affair I'll never fully understand. And as much as I want to believe I've moved on, there's a part of me that knows the past isn't something you can outrun. Months turned into a year, and the life I had with Greg seemed to steady itself like a ship that had weathered a storm. From the outside, everything looked as it should. We were the picture of a happy family. Greg was as reliable and kind as ever, always attentive to the kids and to me, even when I didn't deserve it. The kids thrived, blissfully unaware of the secrets that weighed me down, and I convinced myself that I had successfully buried the past. But secrets have a way of surfacing, even in the quietest moments, and mine haunted me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just guilt, it was the constant awareness that I was living a life built on a lie. Every time Greg looked at me with admiration, every time he thanked me for being such a wonderful wife and mother, I felt the sting of dishonesty. The weight of what I'd done with Ryan lingered in the corners of my mind, and no matter how much I tried to forget, there were always reminders. A fleeting glance at an old text thread I hadn't deleted, a conversation at the boutique that mirrored the easy connection I once shared with Ryan, or the occasional thought of his wife and how close we'd come to ruining 2 marriages. I had thought Ryan's departure from the boutique would bring me peace, but instead, it left me with unanswered questions. Why had he left so abruptly? Had his wife suspected more than he let on? And why did I still think about him, even after everything? I hated myself for it, for the way my thoughts would drift back to him when I least expected it. But it wasn't longing, not anymore. It was something darker, a sense of unfinished business that refused to let me go. Greg, ever perceptive, noticed my restlessness. "Is everything okay?" he asked one evening as we sat together on the couch. I nodded quickly, avoiding his gaze. "Just tired," I said, forcing a smile. He didn't press, but his concern was palpable, and it only made my guilt worse. One day, while cleaning out old files on my phone, I stumbled upon a single photo of Ryan and me. It wasn't incriminating, we were standing with a group of coworkers at a store event, smiling for the camera, but it brought back a rush of memories I wasn't prepared for. My first instinct was to delete it, to erase the evidence of what had happened, but my finger hovered over the delete button. Instead, I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in the picture with the person I was now. Finally, I deleted it, but the act felt hollow, like throwing a single stone into a vast ocean of regret. Around this time, Greg suggested a weekend getaway, just the 2 of us. "We could use some time to ourselves," he said, his tone hopeful. "It's been a while since we've had a chance to reconnect." I hesitated, unsure if I could handle the intimacy of being alone with him while carrying the weight of my betrayal. But I agreed, telling myself it was an opportunity to focus on our marriage and leave the past behind. The trip was idyllic in every way. We stayed in a cozy cabin near a lake, spent our days hiking and kayaking, and our evenings sitting by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that I could move forward, that the love Greg and I shared was strong enough to withstand the secrets I kept from him. But on our last night, as we sat beneath a canopy of stars, Greg turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "Laura," he said, his voice steady, "I need to ask you something." My heart stopped. "Is there anything you're not telling me?" His question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to decide what to say. 1,000 answers swirled in my head, but none of them felt right. Finally, I shook my head, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you think that?" Greg studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he nodded. "I don't know," he said quietly. "Sometimes I just feel like there's something you're holding back." I wanted to tell him the truth in that moment, to finally unburden myself of the weight I'd been carrying. But the fear of losing everything, our marriage, our family, the life we built together, kept me silent. Instead, I reached for his hand and said, "I love you, Greg. You know that, right?" He smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I love you too," he said. As we drove home the next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was bubbling dangerously close to the surface. I told myself that silence was the kindest choice, that Greg was better off not knowing. But deep down, I knew that the secrets we kept from each other had the power to shape our lives in ways we couldn't yet understand. The drive home from our getaway felt like a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Greg seemed content, humming along to the music on the radio, his hand resting lightly on my knee. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that his question the night before had cracked something open. Was it intuition, or had my guilt seeped into the spaces between us, creating fractures in a foundation I'd worked so hard to hold together? As we pulled into the driveway, the kids rushed out to greet us, their laughter filling the air and momentarily chasing away the heaviness in my chest. For the rest of the evening, I focused on them, helping with homework, cooking dinner, and tucking them into bed. But once the house was quiet, the weight of my secrets settled over me again like a blanket I couldn't throw off. Greg had always been perceptive, and that had been one of the things I loved most about him. But now, it felt like a double-edged sword. Every kind gesture, every lingering look, made me wonder if he saw through me, if he could sense the lie woven into the fabric of our lives. I tried to convince myself that my silence was protecting him, but the truth was, it was protecting me. Greg deserved better than the version of me who had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and I hated myself for it. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into every aspect of my life, hoping that busyness would drown out the noise in my head. I volunteered for extra shifts at the boutique, signed up to organize a school fundraiser, and even joined a yoga class with one of my neighbors. Greg noticed the change, but instead of questioning it, he supported me, offering to take over the bedtime routine or pack lunches for the kids. "You've been amazing lately," he said one evening as we sat on the couch. "It's like you found a new spark." His words stung more than he realized, but I smiled and leaned into him, burying my face in his shoulder to hide the tears welling in my eyes. The boutique remained a constant reminder of what I was trying to leave behind. Ryan's absence was both a relief and a void, and I couldn't help but notice how the energy of the store had shifted without him. Every now and then, a customer would ask about him, and I'd force a smile, saying something vague about him moving on to new opportunities. But one afternoon, as I was restocking shelves, a coworker mentioned seeing him at a nearby coffee shop. "He looked good," she said casually. "I think he's doing well." The comment shouldn't have affected me, but it lingered in my mind for the rest of the day. Later that evening, I found myself scrolling through social media, searching for any trace of Ryan. I told myself it was harmless curiosity, but the moment I found his profile, my stomach churned. His page was private, but his profile picture showed him smiling with his wife, their arms wrapped around each other in what looked like a candid moment of happiness. I stared at the photo for far too long, trying to reconcile the version of Ryan I'd known with the man in the picture. Finally, I closed the app and set my phone down, feeling a wave of shame wash over me. As much as I tried to bury the past, it had a way of creeping back into my thoughts at the most inconvenient moments. One night, while Greg and I were out at a dinner party with friends, someone made an offhand comment about infidelity. "I just don't get it," one of the guests said, shaking their head. "If you're unhappy, why not just leave instead of cheating?" The room buzzed with agreement, but I felt a lump rise in my throat. Greg, ever the diplomat, chimed in with a measured response about the complexities of relationships, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. When we got home that night, Greg noticed my silence. "You were awfully quiet tonight," he said, his tone light but curious. Everything okay? I nodded quickly, muttering something about being tired, and went to bed before he could press further. The guilt was beginning to consume me, manifesting in ways I couldn't control. I started having vivid dreams about Ryan, about Greg finding out, about my carefully constructed world crumbling around me. Each morning, I woke up feeling more exhausted than the day before, the weight of my choices pressing heavier on my chest. I knew I needed to let go of the past, but I didn't know how. The idea of confessing to Greg crossed my mind more than once, but every time, I pushed it aside. What good would it do? Telling him wouldn't erase what had happened, and it would only hurt him, and us, in ways that couldn't be undone. One afternoon, as I walked through the park on my way home from the boutique, I spotted a familiar figure sitting on a bench. My heart stopped when I realized it was Ryan. He hadn't seen me, and for a moment, I debated walking past without saying anything. But something compelled me to approach him. "Ryan?" I said hesitantly. He looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to something unreadable. "Laura," he said, standing awkwardly. "Hi." We exchanged pleasantries, our conversation stilted and polite, nothing like the easy banter we'd once shared. He told me about his new job, how his wife was doing, how they'd recently adopted a dog. I nodded along, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside, I felt like I was unraveling. When I mentioned Greg and the kids, his expression softened. "I'm glad things are good for you," he said. "You deserve it." As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel like the chapter with Ryan had finally closed. But as much as I wanted to believe that was the end of it, I knew the real battle was just beginning, the battle to forgive myself and find a way to truly move on. Even after running into Ryan at the park, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was teetering on a precarious edge. Our brief conversation had been polite, uneventful even, but it left a strange emptiness inside me. I hadn't expected closure, exactly, but I thought seeing him might finally help me let go of the lingering guilt. Instead, it reminded me of just how much I had to lose if my secret ever came out. Ryan seemed to have moved on effortlessly, his life clicking into place like nothing had ever happened. For me, however, the past felt like a ghost that refused to stay buried. The days after our encounter were a blur of anxiety and overthinking. Every time Greg looked at me, I wondered if he could see the guilt written on my face. Every innocent question from the kids, about work, about my mood, about why I seemed so tired lately, felt like a test I was failing. I started to avoid the little moments of intimacy that used to bring us closer. When Greg would reach for my hand during a movie or lean in to kiss me goodnight, I found myself pulling away without meaning to. "Everything okay?" he asked one night, his voice laced with concern. I forced a smile, mumbling something about being stressed from work. He didn't push, but I could see the worry etched into his face, and it only made me feel worse. The boutique, once my escape from the monotony of home life, now felt suffocating. Every corner of the store seemed to hold a memory of Ryan, the aisle where we'd laughed over some silly customer request, the break room where we'd shared stolen moments, the security camera feed that had once felt like our little secret. Even my coworkers seemed to sense a shift in me. "You've been quiet lately," one of them remarked as we restocked shelves. "Everything okay?" I nodded, brushing off their concern with a quick excuse, but inside, I felt like I was unraveling. One evening, as I cleaned up after dinner, Greg came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, watching me. "Laura," he began, his tone careful, "I've been thinking, maybe we should take some time for ourselves. A trip, just the two of us. What do you think?" The suggestion caught me off guard. I hesitated, my mind racing with excuses, but the hopeful look on his face stopped me. "That sounds nice," I said finally, forcing a smile. We started planning a weekend getaway to a cozy cabin a few hours away, the same place we'd gone early in our marriage. Greg was excited, throwing himself into the details with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in a long time. I tried to match his energy, but every time I thought about the trip, my chest tightened. The idea of spending an entire weekend alone with him, without the distractions of work or the kids, filled me with dread. What if he asked me more questions I couldn't answer? What if my guilt finally spilled over? The night before we were set to leave, I stayed up late packing, my thoughts spinning in endless circles. Greg came into the room, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You don't seem excited," he said softly. "If you don't want to go, we don't have to." His kindness nearly broke me. "No, I want to go," I said quickly. "I'm just tired. It's been a long week." He nodded, accepting my answer, but the sadness in his eyes lingered. The drive to the cabin was quiet, the weight of unspoken words filling the car. Greg reached for my hand as we turned onto the winding road that led to the cabin, and for a moment, I let myself relax. The sight of the familiar place, the rustic wooden cabin surrounded by trees, the lake shimmering in the distance, brought a rush of memories, both good and bittersweet. "It's just like I remember," Greg said, smiling. The first day was idyllic in every way. We hiked along forest trails, shared a picnic by the lake, and spent the evening curled up by the fire with glasses of wine. For a moment, it felt like we'd turned back time to the early days of our marriage, when everything had felt easy and uncomplicated. But as the night wore on, the walls I'd built around myself began to crack. Sitting by the fire, Greg turned to me with a serious expression. "Laura, can I ask you something?" My heart stopped. "Of course," I said, trying to sound calm. "Do you ever feel like we're not as close as we used to be?" His question hit me like a punch to the stomach. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. "It's just," he continued, "sometimes it feels like there's something between us. Something I can't quite put my finger on." I looked away, the guilt rising in my throat like bile. "Greg, I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle but firm. "Whatever it is, you can tell me," he said. "We'll figure it out together." Tears welled in my eyes, and for a moment, I considered telling him everything, about Ryan, about the affair, about the weight I'd been carrying for so long. But the fear of what that truth would do to him, to us, kept me silent. "I just feel like I've been in a rut," I said finally, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. "Work's been stressful, and I guess I've been taking it out on you." Greg nodded, his expression softening. "That's all it is?" he asked. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "That's all it is," I repeated. As we climbed into bed that night, I felt a strange mixture of relief and despair. I'd managed to keep my secret, but at what cost? Lying to Greg felt like tearing at the very fabric of our marriage, and yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of forced smiles and half-hearted conversations. Greg seemed reassured, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. As we drove back from the cabin, the tension I had tried so hard to suppress began to seep into every corner of my mind. Greg seemed lighter, happier even, as though our weekend had been a balm for his own worries. He hummed along to the music on the radio, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand or comment on the scenery. I nodded and smiled where appropriate, but inside, the weight of my secret threatened to crush me. I had promised myself that the trip would mark a turning point, that I would find a way to move forward and leave the past behind, but instead, I felt more trapped than ever. Once we were home, life resumed its usual rhythm. The kids were thrilled to have us back, their excitement a welcome distraction from the unease that lingered in my chest. Greg threw himself back into work with renewed energy, and I busied myself with errands, household chores, and shifts at the boutique. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but beneath the facade, cracks were beginning to form. I started to notice little changes in Greg, subtle things that I might not have picked up on if I weren't so consumed by guilt. He'd linger over his coffee in the mornings, staring into the distance as though lost in thought. He asked more questions about my day, about the people I worked with, about how I was feeling. His tone was casual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was probing, searching for something he couldn't quite put into words. "You've been distant lately," he said one evening as we washed dishes together. "Is everything okay?" I forced a laugh, wiping my hands on a towel. "Of course," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Why wouldn't it be?" Greg didn't press the issue, but his expression told me he wasn't convinced. The thought that he might be piecing things together sent a wave of panic through me. I doubled down on my efforts to appear cheerful and attentive, pouring all my energy into being the perfect wife and mother. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that my carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. One afternoon, while tidying up the bedroom, I stumbled upon something that made my heart stop: Greg's phone, left unlocked on the nightstand. I hesitated, torn between respecting his privacy and satisfying the nagging fear that had taken root in my mind. Finally, unable to resist, I picked it up and quickly scrolled through his messages. There was nothing suspicious, nothing out of the ordinary, but the act of snooping left me feeling hollow and ashamed. That evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Greg turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Laura," he said, "have you ever thought about going to counseling?" The question caught me off guard. "Counseling?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why would you say that?" Greg shrugged, his gaze steady. "I just think it might help. You've been carrying a lot lately, and I want to make sure you're okay." His concern was genuine, and for a moment, I considered taking him up on the offer. Maybe counseling could help me work through the guilt, the lies, the tangled mess I'd created. But the thought of opening up to someone, of risking the truth coming out, was too terrifying to entertain. "I appreciate it," I said finally, "but I'm fine." "Really?" Greg didn't push, but the conversation left me shaken. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about how much I had to lose. Greg deserved the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to give it to him. What if he couldn't forgive me? What if the life we'd built together fell apart? As the weeks went on, the weight of my secret continued to grow, affecting every aspect of my life. I found myself snapping at the kids over small things, retreating from friends, and avoiding any situation that might lead to deeper conversations with Greg. The distance between us, though invisible, was palpable, and I knew he felt it too. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, Greg broke the silence. "Laura," he said, his voice soft but firm, "if there's something you need to tell me, I hope you know you can. I'd rather hear it from you than find out some other way." His words sent a chill through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound calm. Greg hesitated, searching my face. "I don't know," he said finally. "Sometimes it feels like there's a wall between us, and I can't figure out why. I just want to make sure we're okay." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. I wanted to tell him everything, to unburden myself of the guilt that had consumed me for so long. But the fear of what that truth would do to him, to us, held me back. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "We're okay, Greg. I promise." But as I looked into his eyes, I knew the lie wasn't enough. The days following Greg's quiet confrontation on the porch were some of the most agonizing of my life. His words replayed in my mind constantly, his gentle probing, his unspoken plea for honesty. "I'd rather hear it from you," he had said, and the truth of that statement was what haunted me most. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever, pretending everything was fine while carrying the weight of my betrayal. But the idea of confessing felt like stepping off a cliff into an abyss, and I wasn't ready for what might be waiting at the bottom. Greg, for his part, didn't bring it up again. He went back to his routines, smiling at me over breakfast, helping with the kids' homework, and wrapping his arm around me during movie nights as if nothing had changed. But I could see it in his eyes, the questions, the doubt, the quiet fear that maybe things weren't as stable as they seemed. And that doubt was like a mirror, reflecting my own inner turmoil back at me. At work, the tension followed me like a shadow. The boutique had always been a place where I could lose myself in the bustle of customers and the monotony of restocking shelves, but now it felt suffocating. I avoided conversations with coworkers, wary of letting anything slip, and every time someone mentioned Ryan in passing, I felt a wave of nausea. Though he was gone, his presence lingered, a ghost in the place where we had shared stolen moments and crossed unforgivable lines. One afternoon, as I was organizing a display near the front of the store, a woman walked in who looked eerily familiar. She was tall, with striking features and a confident stride that caught everyone's attention. My heart sank when I realized who she was, Ryan's wife. She had been in the store once before, months ago, but I hadn't expected to see her again. This time, she didn't browse. She walked straight to the counter, her gaze sweeping the room before landing on me. For a moment, I froze, my mind racing as I tried to remember if I'd ever said or done anything that might have tipped her off. But her expression didn't betray any suspicion, only curiosity. "Hi," she said, her voice polite but direct. "I'm looking for a gift for my husband. Something simple but thoughtful." The irony of her request wasn't lost on me, and I forced a smile as I led her to a display of men's accessories. As she browsed, she made small talk, mentioning that Ryan had started a new job and that they were thinking about moving closer to her family. I nodded along, offering generic responses, but inside, I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. When she finally left, a wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Her presence had stirred up everything I had tried so hard to bury, and I spent the rest of the day in a fog. That evening, as I sat at the dinner table with Greg and the kids, I couldn't shake the feeling that my carefully constructed world was on the verge of collapse. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Greg turned to me. "You've been quiet lately," he said gently. "Is there something on your mind?" I swallowed hard, willing myself to come up with a response that wouldn't unravel everything. "Just tired," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Greg didn't press, but I could tell he didn't believe me. The following week, the pressure reached a breaking point. I was driving home from work when I saw Ryan's wife again, walking down the sidewalk with a friend. The sight of her was like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder that the past wasn't as far behind me as I wanted to believe. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. For the first time, I allowed myself to confront the full weight of what I had done, not just to Greg, but to myself, to Ryan's wife, to the lives we had both upended for a fleeting connection that had left nothing but devastation in its wake. When I got home that evening, Greg was sitting on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mix of concern and resignation. "We need to talk," he said simply. The words sent a jolt of panic through me, but I nodded, knowing there was no avoiding it this time. I sat down beside him, the cool night air wrapping around us like a shroud. "Greg," I began, my voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I saw the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago, the man who had always believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. "Whatever it is," he said softly, "we'll get through it together." The words were a lifeline, and yet they only made what I had to say that much harder. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out, the weight of my guilt silencing me. Finally, I looked away, my hands twisting in my lap. "I made a mistake," I said finally. "A terrible mistake." Greg's expression didn't change, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his grip tightened on the edge of his chair. "What kind of mistake?" he asked, his voice calm but steady. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for the impact. "I don't know how to say this," I whispered. "But I need you to know that it's over, and it will never happen again." Greg didn't respond right away, and the silence between us felt unbearable. Finally, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I need some time," he said quietly. "I'll be inside." As I watched him walk away, the weight of everything I had been carrying came crashing down around me. For the first time, I realized that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. The silence that followed Greg's quiet retreat into the house felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. I sat on the porch for what felt like hours, replaying his words in my mind, "I need some time." He hadn't yelled, he hadn't demanded answers, but somehow, his calmness was even more unsettling. I had expected anger, maybe even accusations, but his measured response left me reeling. What did he know? What had I said, or left unsaid, that hinted at the truth I couldn't bring myself to fully confess? When I finally went inside, the house was quiet. The kids were already asleep, their soft breathing filling the upstairs hallway as I passed their rooms. Greg was in the living room, sitting in the armchair with a book in his lap, though he wasn't reading. His gaze was distant, his fingers idly tracing the edges of the pages. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to approach him or retreat to the bedroom. "Do you want to talk?" I asked softly, my voice breaking the stillness. Greg looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a weight that made my chest tighten. "Not tonight," he said simply. "I need to think." I nodded, the lump in my throat making it impossible to speak. Without another word, I turned and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the sheets felt like a reminder of the distance growing between us. The next morning, Greg was already up when I came downstairs. He was making pancakes, a Saturday morning tradition that the kids adored, but his usual light-hearted banter was absent. He moved through the kitchen with a quiet efficiency, nodding a greeting when I entered but offering nothing more. The kids, blissfully unaware of the tension between us, chattered excitedly about their plans for the day, and I did my best to keep up appearances. After breakfast, Greg announced that he was taking the kids to the park. "You should take some time for yourself," he said, his tone neutral. "We'll be back in a couple of hours." I nodded, unsure how to respond. As they left, I stood in the doorway, watching them pile into the car. Greg glanced back at me once before pulling out of the driveway, his expression unreadable. The emptiness of the house was suffocating. I tried to distract myself with chores, folding laundry, organizing the pantry, anything to keep my hands busy, but my mind refused to quiet. The weight of my half-confession hung over me like a storm cloud, and I couldn't stop replaying the conversation on the porch. Had I said enough to ease Greg's doubts, or had I only made them worse? When Greg and the kids returned, the air between us felt different. He wasn't cold or distant, but there was a formality to his demeanor that hadn't been there before. We went through the motions of the day, lunch, homework, an evening movie, but the unspoken tension lingered. That night, as we got ready for bed, Greg finally broke the silence. "I need to ask you something," he said, his voice low but steady. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to face him. "Okay," I said cautiously. "Are you happy, Laura?" he asked, his gaze searching mine. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked, stalling for time. Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I mean, are you happy in this marriage? With me? Because lately, it feels like you're not. And I need to know if there's something I'm missing, if there's something you're not telling me." The honesty in his voice was like a knife to my chest. I wanted to tell him the truth, to lay everything out and let him decide whether we could rebuild from the ashes. But the fear of losing him, of shattering the life we had built, kept me silent. "I'm happy," I said finally, though the words felt hollow. "I've just been overwhelmed. With work, with the kids, with everything. But it's not you, Greg. It's not us." He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Okay," he said finally, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. In the days that followed, things returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the cracks in our foundation were impossible to ignore. Greg was attentive, present, and kind, but there was a guardedness to his interactions with me, a sense that he was holding something back. I couldn't blame him, I was doing the same. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, he reached for my hand. "Laura," he said quietly, "I love you. I hope you know that." Tears welled in my eyes as I nodded. "I love you too," I said, my voice trembling. But as I sat there, holding his hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth would eventually come out, whether I was ready for it or not. The days blurred into weeks, and though life on the surface seemed stable, the tension between Greg and me grew like an unspoken weight pressing down on both of us. He continued to be the attentive husband and doting father, but his actions carried a new layer of hesitation, as if he was walking on eggshells, unsure of where we stood. I could feel the unspoken questions simmering beneath his every glance, every moment of quiet between us. For my part, I tried harder than ever to maintain the illusion of normalcy. I overcompensated in ways I hoped Greg would see as signs of my commitment to our family: elaborate dinners, surprise outings with the kids, even moments of forced intimacy with Greg that left me feeling hollow and disconnected. Every smile I offered him felt like a lie, every affectionate touch a betrayal. The weight of my secret was no longer something I carried alone, it had seeped into the fabric of our marriage, creating a distance I couldn't seem to bridge. Greg's guardedness became more pronounced, and though he didn't press me directly, I could feel his silent scrutiny, his quiet attempts to piece together what I wouldn't say. One evening, as we sat in the living room after the kids had gone to bed, Greg put down his book and turned to me. "Laura," he said carefully, "I've been thinking, maybe we should see a counselor. Together." The suggestion sent a jolt of panic through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Why?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Greg hesitated, his gaze steady. "Because I feel like there's something between us that we're not addressing. I don't know what it is, but I don't want it to grow into something we can't fix." His words were a lifeline, a reminder that despite everything, he still wanted to fight for us. But the idea of sitting in a room with a counselor, of opening myself up to scrutiny and risking the truth coming out, was too much to bear. "I think we're okay," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "We just need to communicate more, that's all." Greg didn't argue, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. "Okay," he said softly. "But if you change your mind, I'm here." As the weeks went on, the distance between us grew harder to ignore. The kids seemed oblivious, but I knew they could sense the subtle shift in the air, the quiet moments that lingered too long, the way Greg and I avoided eye contact when certain topics came up. I told myself I was protecting them by keeping the truth hidden, but deep down, I knew I was only delaying the inevitable. One afternoon, as I was leaving work, I spotted Ryan's wife again. She was walking into a coffee shop across the street, her confident stride and radiant smile a stark contrast to the turmoil I felt inside. I watched her from a distance, wondering if she had any inkling of what had happened between Ryan and me. Did she ever suspect? Did she have doubts about her husband the way Greg now had about me? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. That evening, as Greg and I sat at the dinner table with the kids, I found myself watching him closely. He was laughing at a story our son was telling, his smile genuine and unguarded. It struck me then how much I had taken for granted, the stability, the love, the trust we had once shared. And now, all of it was teetering on the edge of collapse because of a mistake I couldn't undo. After the kids went to bed, Greg and I sat together on the couch, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. Finally, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Laura," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something." My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "What is it?" Greg hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. The question took me by surprise, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "Of course I am," I said finally, though the words felt hollow. "Why wouldn't I be?" He studied me for a long moment, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "Because sometimes, it feels like you're not," he said softly. "And I don't know if it's something I've done, or if there's something you're not telling me. But I need to know, Laura. I need to know what's really going on. The honesty in his voice cut through me like a blade, and for a moment, I considered telling him everything. I thought about the affair, about Ryan, about the weight of my guilt and the lies I had woven to protect myself. But the fear of losing Greg, of shattering the life we had built together, kept me silent. I'm just tired, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. It's been a lot lately, with work and the kids. But it's not you, Greg. It's not us. Greg nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Okay, he said finally. But if there's ever something you need to tell me, I hope you know you can. His words stayed with me long after he went to bed, a quiet reminder that the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how hard you try to bury it. As I lay awake in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, that the life I had worked so hard to protect was slipping through my fingers. The days that followed Greg's question felt like walking a tightrope stretched impossibly thin. I couldn't tell whether I was maintaining my balance or simply prolonging the inevitable fall. Greg's demeanor hadn't changed much, he was still kind and attentive, still Greg, but there was a quietness in him now that hadn't been there before. It wasn't distance exactly, but a sense of waiting, of giving me space to come to him with the truth he already seemed to suspect. I found myself watching him closely, analyzing every interaction for signs that he knew more than he let on. Did he notice the way I tensed when he asked about my day? Did he wonder why I seemed reluctant to meet his gaze when we talked? The paranoia was exhausting, and no amount of overcompensating seemed to ease it. At the boutique, I threw myself into work, staying late to avoid the quiet tension at home. My co-workers commented on my dedication, but I could see the curiosity in their eyes. "Everything okay, Laura?" one of them asked one afternoon as we folded clothes near the register. "You've been working non-stop lately." "Just keeping busy," I said with a forced smile, brushing off her concern. But the truth was, I wasn't sure what I was trying to avoid more, Greg's quiet scrutiny or my own thoughts. One evening, as I sat in the parking lot after my shift, I scrolled mindlessly through my phone, hoping to distract myself. Without thinking, I typed Ryan's name into the search bar, my heart pounding as I clicked on his profile. His page was still private, but his profile picture had changed, a photo of him and his wife smiling at what looked like a family gathering. I stared at it for a long moment, the familiar pang of guilt rising in my chest. Closing the app, I tossed my phone onto the passenger seat and leaned back, closing my eyes. Why couldn't I let this go? When I got home, Greg was sitting on the porch, sipping a cup of tea. He looked up as I approached, his expression calm but serious. "Late shift?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, sitting down beside him. "Things have been busy." Greg nodded, taking another sip before setting his mug down. "Laura," he began carefully, "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us." My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to stay composed. "What about us?" He turned to face me, his gaze steady. "I feel like there's something you're not telling me," he said softly. "I don't know what it is, but I can feel it. And I need to know if there's something we need to talk about." The air between us felt heavy, and for a moment, I considered telling him everything. The affair, the lies, the guilt that had consumed me for months, it all hovered on the tip of my tongue, begging to be released. But the fear of what that truth would do to him, to our family, held me back. "There's nothing," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I've just been stressed, that's all." Greg studied me for a long moment, and I could see the hurt in his eyes. "If that's what you want me to believe," he said quietly, "then I'll believe it. But I hope you know that whatever it is, I can handle it. I just want you to be honest with me." His words stayed with me long after he went to bed, echoing in my mind as I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I wanted to believe that keeping the truth hidden was the right thing to do, that sparing Greg the pain of knowing would somehow make up for what I'd done. But deep down, I knew I was only delaying the inevitable. The next morning, as I made breakfast for the kids, Greg came into the kitchen and wrapped his arms around me from behind. "I love you, Laura," he said softly, his voice full of quiet sincerity. Tears welled in my eyes as I leaned into him, the weight of my secret threatening to crush me. "I love you too," I whispered, though the words felt hollow. As the days went on, the tension between us grew harder to ignore. Greg's patience, while admirable, only made my guilt more unbearable. Every kind gesture, every moment of connection felt like a reminder of the trust one had betrayed. I started to wonder if the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. One evening, after the kids were in bed, Greg sat me down in the living room. "Laura," he said gently, "I've been trying to give you space, but I can't keep pretending that everything's fine. If there's something you need to tell me, now's the time." My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and resignation. "Greg, I trailed off, my voice breaking." He reached for my hand, his touch steady and reassuring. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it together," he said. "But I need you to be honest with me." The sincerity in his voice broke something inside me, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility of telling him the truth. Maybe it was time to let go of the lies and face the consequences of my actions. Taking a deep breath, I met his gaze and said, "There's something I need to tell you." As I sat across from Greg in the living room, his hand steady in mine, the words I'd been holding back for months pressed against my chest, desperate to escape. The silence between us felt like a chasm, and I knew there was no way forward without crossing it. "Greg," I began, my voice trembling, "what I'm about to tell you is going to hurt, and I'm so sorry for that." His brow furrowed, and he leaned forward slightly, his concern deepening. "Just tell me, Laura," he said softly. "Whatever it is, I need to hear it." I took a shaky breath, feeling the tears welling up in my eyes. "A few months ago, when I was working at the boutique, I made a mistake, a terrible mistake." My voice cracked, but I forced myself to keep going. I let myself get too close to someone. A coworker. Greg's hand stiffened in mine, and I could see the shock flicker across his face. "Too close," he echoed, his voice careful but strained. "What do you mean, Laura?" I couldn't look at him. It wasn't just emotional, I admitted, my words barely above a whisper. It crossed a line. I crossed a line. For a moment, the room was silent except for the sound of my uneven breathing. When I finally gathered the courage to look at Greg, his expression was unreadable, his face pale, his jaw clenched, his eyes clouded with disbelief. "Are you telling me?" he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I'm so sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "It's over, Greg. It's been over for months, and it meant nothing. But I hate myself for what I did, and I hate that I've hurt you." Greg stood abruptly, pulling his hand away from mine as he paced the room. His movements were sharp, restless, as though he was trying to outrun the weight of what I'd just told him. "Who was it?" he asked finally, his voice cold and distant. "Someone from work," I said. "He's not there anymore. He left months ago." Greg stopped pacing and turned to face me, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and pain. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why would you do this, Laura? I've been nothing but loyal to you. I've loved you. I've built a life with you. How could you throw that away?" "I don't know," I sobbed, my hands trembling in my lap. "I was lonely, Greg. I felt invisible. But that's not an excuse. It was wrong, and I take full responsibility for it." He shook his head, running a hand through his hair as he let out a bitter laugh. "Invisible? I've been here the whole time, Laura. I've been here for you, for the kids, for this family. And you," his voice cracked, and he turned away, his shoulders heaving. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that I loved him, that I was sorry, that I would do anything to make it right. But I knew my words would only feel hollow in that moment. Instead, I sat in silence, watching as the man I loved tried to process the betrayal I had brought into our lives. After what felt like an eternity, Greg turned back to me, his eyes red but his expression resolute. "I need time," he said quietly. I can't do this right now." "Take all the time you need," I said, my voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right, Greg. I swear." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked past me and out the front door, leaving me alone in the quiet of the living room. The days that followed were some of the most painful I'd ever experienced. Greg stayed in the house for the kids' sake, but our interactions were minimal and strained. He slept in the guest room, avoided eye contact, and spoke to me only when absolutely necessary. The kids noticed the change, their innocent questions about why Daddy wasn't sleeping in the same room as Mommy cutting deeper than any argument ever could. I threw myself into therapy, desperate to understand why I had made the choices I had and how to begin repairing the damage I'd done. My therapist encouraged me to focus on accountability and self-reflection, but the guilt I carried felt insurmountable. Greg, too, seemed to be searching for answers. He started taking long walks after dinner, his absence during those times a reminder of the distance between us. One evening, as I sat on the porch waiting for him to return, I saw him walking up the driveway, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice calm but guarded. "Of course," I said, standing to meet him. We sat together on the porch steps, the cool night air wrapping around us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, Greg broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, his gaze fixed on the stars. "About us. About what this means for our marriage." I held my breath, waiting for him to continue. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, Laura," he said, his voice trembling. "But I don't want to make any decisions out of anger. We have too much history, too much at stake." Tears welled in my eyes as I nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes, Greg," I said. "I'll go to counseling, I'll give you space, whatever you need." He turned to look at me, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and determination. "I'm not making any promises," he said. "But I'm willing to try, for the kids, for us. But it's going to take time." "That's all I'm asking for," I said, my voice breaking. "A chance to fix what I've broken." As we sat together on the porch, the weight of my confession still heavy between us, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't absolution, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. The morning after our conversation on the porch, the air between Greg and me was heavy but no longer suffocating. There was something almost fragile in the way we moved around each other, careful, tentative, as if acknowledging the shared weight of what lay ahead. Greg still slept in the guest room, but he stayed for breakfast that morning, helping the kids pour their cereal and talking about the day's plans. The kids didn't seem to notice the shift in tone between us, their laughter filling the kitchen in a way that felt bittersweet. After Greg left for work, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched cup of coffee. My mind was spinning with the enormity of what lay ahead. Greg's willingness to try again, even tentatively, felt like a lifeline, but it also carried an immense responsibility. If we were going to rebuild, I needed to confront not just my mistakes but the underlying reasons for them, no matter how uncomfortable that might be. I threw myself into therapy with renewed determination, delving deeper into the choices that had brought me to this point. My therapist challenged me to confront the parts of myself I'd avoided for years, my feelings of inadequacy as a wife and mother, my fear of vulnerability, and my tendency to seek validation in unhealthy ways. It was grueling work, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving towards something instead of running away. Greg, too, seemed to be doing his own work. He began attending counseling sessions on his own, though he didn't share much about what he discussed there. "It's helping," he said simply when I asked, and I respected his need for privacy. After a few weeks, he suggested we try couples counseling, a step that felt both daunting and necessary. Our first session was raw and emotional, the wounds of my betrayal laid bare in a way that made my chest ache. "I feel like I don't even know who you are anymore," Greg said at one point, his voice trembling. "How do I trust someone who kept something like this from me for so long?" "I don't have a perfect answer," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "But I'm here, Greg. I'm not running away from this, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back." Our counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Diane, guided us through the process with patience and empathy. She encouraged Greg to express his feelings fully, without holding back, and pushed me to listen without becoming defensive. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it also felt like a necessary step toward healing. Outside of counseling, Greg and I began finding small ways to reconnect. We started having coffee together in the mornings before the kids woke up, sitting in silence at first but gradually easing into light conversation. On weekends, we took the kids to the park or the zoo, presenting a united front even as we worked through our private struggles. One evening, as we sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, Greg turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about why it happened?" he asked, his tone careful but curious. "All the time," I said, my voice quiet. "I've spent so many nights asking myself how I could do something so hurtful to the person I love most. And the only answer I can come up with is that I lost sight of who I was, and who we were. But that's not an excuse, Greg. It's just the truth." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I guess I've been asking myself the same thing," he admitted. "Not just about you, but about me. About what I might have done differently." His willingness to share that vulnerability felt like a breakthrough, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. As the weeks turned into months, the tentative connection between us began to grow stronger. Greg still had moments of doubt and anger, moments when the weight of my betrayal threatened to pull him under, but he faced those feelings head-on instead of shutting me out. And I, for my part, worked to meet him where he was, offering honesty and patience even when it was difficult. The kids, blissfully unaware of the complexities of our relationship, seemed happier than ever. They beamed whenever Greg and I sat together at the dinner table, their joy a reminder of what we were fighting for. One evening, after a particularly emotional counseling session, Greg and I went for a walk together. The air was crisp, the stars bright above us, and for a moment, the weight of everything we'd been through seemed to lift. "I don't know where we're going to end up," Greg said quietly, his hand brushing against mine as we walked. "But I'm starting to believe that maybe we can get there together." I looked at him, my heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and love. "Me too," I said softly. As we walked home, I realized that while the road ahead would be long and difficult, we were finally moving forward. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope that we might make it. Months turned into a year, and though the scars of what had happened were still there, Greg and I had found a rhythm, an uneasy but hopeful balance as we rebuilt the foundation of our marriage. The road had been anything but easy. There were moments of doubt, of anger, of silence so heavy it felt like it would swallow us both whole. But there were also moments of connection, of laughter, of quiet reassurances that reminded us of what we were fighting for. Our sessions with Diane had become less frequent, though we still attended when something came up that we couldn't navigate on our own. Greg had learned to articulate his feelings in ways that were honest but not cruel, and I had learned to sit with his pain without letting my own guilt consume the conversation. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the kids play in the yard, Greg turned to me with a look that I couldn't quite place. "You know," he began, his voice steady, "if you told me a year ago that we'd be sitting here like this, I wouldn't have believed it." I smiled, though his words carried a bittersweet weight. "Me neither," I admitted. "There were times I thought we'd never make it through." He nodded, his gaze shifting to the kids. "I'm still not sure if we're fully through it," he said. "But I'm glad we didn't give up." His honesty was a reminder of how far we'd come. A year ago, I had sat in this same spot, paralyzed by fear and guilt, unable to imagine a future where Greg and I could coexist, let alone rebuild something meaningful. Now, as I watched him smile at our daughter's antics, I felt a quiet gratitude for the resilience we'd found in ourselves and in each other. As the kids ran inside for dinner, Greg reached for my hand, his touch grounding me in the present. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone contemplative, "about what it means to forgive. Not just you, but myself too." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. Greg sighed, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. "I've spent so much time thinking about what I could have done differently, what signs I missed, what I could have been for you that I wasn't. And I know that's not all on me, but it's hard not to carry that weight." Tears filled my eyes as I squeezed his hand. "Greg, you didn't do anything wrong. You've been more patient, more loving than I ever deserved. And I'm so sorry for putting you in this position." He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We both made mistakes, Laura. Yours were bigger, sure, but I wasn't perfect. I got complacent. I didn't always see you the way I should have. And I'm not saying that to excuse what happened, I'm saying it because I want to learn from it. I want us to be better." His words felt like a gift, one I didn't feel worthy of but was determined to cherish. "I want that too," I said, my voice trembling. "More than anything." That night, as we tucked the kids into bed, the house felt warmer, fuller than it had in a long time. Greg and I sat together on the couch, our shoulders touching as we shared a quiet moment of peace. "Do you think we'll ever get back to how we were?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Greg considered this for a moment before shaking his head. "No," he said simply. "But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we can build something stronger. Something honest." His words stayed with me, a reminder that healing wasn't about erasing the past but about moving forward with intention. In the weeks that followed, Greg and I continued to find our footing, leaning on each other in ways that felt new and unfamiliar but also deeply comforting. We started going on date nights again, carving out time for ourselves amidst the chaos of work and parenting. There were still moments of tension, moments when the weight of what had happened threatened to pull us under, but we faced them together, with a resolve that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, as we walked through the park with the kids, Greg stopped suddenly and turned to me. "Laura," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I forgive you." The words hit me like a wave, and tears spilled down my cheeks as I nodded, unable to speak. "Thank you," I whispered finally, my voice breaking. Greg reached for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I don't know what the future holds," he said. "But I know that I want it to include you." In that moment, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Our journey wasn't over, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead, but for the first time, I believed that we could face them together. As the sun set over the park, casting a warm glow over the horizon, I looked at Greg and saw not just the man I had hurt but the man I loved, the man who had fought for our family even when it would have been easier to walk away. And I knew, deep in my heart, that we were going to be okay.